By the time German intelligence officers calculated that the Soviet Union was producing 3 T-34 tanks for every Panzer IV Germany built, the Eastern Front was already lost. The numbers had been available since 1941, documented in reports that sat in filing cabinets while planners used estimates based not on evidence but on ideology. Hitler had been shown aerial photographs of Soviet industrial facilities beyond the Urals, had read assessments of Soviet production potential, and had dismissed them all because they contradicted what Nazi racial theory said a Slavic state could accomplish. This was not a failure of intelligence gathering. It was a deliberate choice to trust ideology over mathematics, and that choice buried the Wehrmacht under an avalanche of Soviet steel. Nazi ideology taught that Slavic peoples were racially inferior, incapable of the organizational sophistication and technical competence that modern industrial production required. This was not casual prejudice. It was systematic doctrine taught in party schools, military academies, and economic planning offices. When German economists and military planners assessed Soviet industrial capacity before Operation Barbarossa, they began with the ideological premise that Soviet industry must be primitive, inefficient, and incapable of matching German production quality or quantity. The evidence suggested otherwise, but evidence was filtered through ideology. Soviet factories were acknowledged to exist, but assumed to be poorly managed and producing inferior equipment. Soviet technical education was documented, but dismissed as superficial. The ideological lens through which Germany viewed the Soviet Union made accurate assessment impossible before the first shot was fired. German intelligence services had collected substantial evidence about Soviet industrial capacity before Barbarossa. The Abwehr had documented major industrial centers in the Urals and beyond. Aerial reconnaissance had photographed Soviet tank factories. Technical intelligence had obtained Soviet equipment for analysis. Trade relationships in the 1930s had provided detailed knowledge of Soviet industrial development. The evidence painted a picture of a massive industrial base that had been developed through the 5-year plans. But when intelligence officers compiled their estimates, they faced systematic pressure to reduce their numbers. Reports estimating high Soviet production capacity were rejected as alarmist. Assessments suggesting Soviet technical competence were dismissed as defeatist. The intelligence apparatus learned that accurate reporting was career-damaging while ideologically comfortable reporting was rewarded. When German economic planners calculated the resources needed for Operation Barbarossa, they based their estimates on Soviet production capacity they assumed Germany would face. Their calculations suggested the Soviet Union could field perhaps 15,000 tanks total, most of them obsolete. They estimated Soviet aircraft production at similar levels to Germany's. They assumed Soviet industrial facilities were concentrated in western regions that German forces would quickly capture. These assumptions shaped everything: the ammunition allocated, the replacement equipment planned, the timeline for achieving victory. The entire invasion plan was built on production estimates that were wrong by factors of 3 to 5. This was not a minor miscalculation that could be adjusted. It was a fundamental error that made the entire strategic concept unworkable. German forces first encountered the T-34 tank in summer 1941 and were shocked. Intelligence had not predicted a tank of this capability existed in Soviet service. The T-34 was better armored than most German tanks, more mobile, and being produced in quantities intelligence had said were impossible. Similar surprises followed. The KV-1 heavy tank was virtually immune to standard German anti-tank weapons. Soviet artillery appeared in unexpected quantities. Il-2 ground attack aircraft operated in numbers German planners had not anticipated. Each encounter suggested that intelligence estimates had been drastically wrong. But the invasion was already underway, committed to a timeline and logistics plan based on the false estimates. German commanders requested revised intelligence assessments and additional anti-tank weapons. What they received was reassurance that Soviet production was unsustainable and would soon collapse. Even as evidence mounted that Soviet production exceeded German estimates, the ideological assumption of Soviet inferiority remained unchanged. German planners explained away each discrepancy. By late 1941, German intelligence began to understand a reality that planning had never acknowledged. The Soviet Union had built a massive industrial base beyond the Urals, far from German bomber range and unreachable by ground forces. The factories evacuated from Western Soviet territory were not destroyed but relocated and already. By 1942, comparative production statistics made Germany's situation mathematically clear. The Soviet Union was producing approximately 24,000 tanks per year. Germany was producing 11,000. Soviet aircraft production was running at 30,000 per year. German production was 15,000. The gap was not narrowing. It was widening. German industry was running at maximum capacity while Soviet industry was still ramping up. Even more concerning, Soviet production was concentrated in a few standard models, T-34 tanks, Il-2 attack aircraft, Katyusha rocket launchers, while German production was dispersed across multiple competing designs. Soviet numerical superiority was compounding monthly. Every calculation showed that Germany was being buried under an industrial avalanche, and no increase in German production rates could change the fundamental arithmetic. Faced with overwhelming Soviet numerical superiority, German leadership retreated into another ideologically comforting belief: German technical quality would overcome Soviet quantity. This contained partial truth. German tanks were often technically superior to individual Soviet models. German crews were generally better trained. German tactical doctrine was more sophisticated. But ideology prevented accepting that quality could not overcome quantity disparities of 3 or 4 to 1. When German planners proposed that Germany needed to match Soviet production numbers, they were told this was unnecessary because German superiority meant 1 German tank equaled 3 Soviet tanks. This was magical thinking. Arithmetic does not care about qualitative advantages. 3 T-34s could destroy 1 Tiger tank through numerical concentration. Soviet industry understood this fundamental reality. German ideology prevented accepting it. Albert Speer became Minister of Armaments in February 1942 and immediately recognized that Germany was losing the industrial war catastrophically. He compiled detailed reports showing Soviet production exceeding German output across every category of military equipment. He presented Hitler with evidence that Soviet industry was not only larger than German intelligence had estimated but was continuing to expand while German industry was reaching its limits. Speer's analysis was professional, documented, and terrifying. Germany had invaded the Soviet Union assuming it faced an industrial inferior. Instead, it faced an industrial superior that was geographically invulnerable to German attack. Speer's reports should have triggered a fundamental strategic reassessment. Instead, Hitler dismissed them as defeatism and insisted that German willpower would prevail over Soviet production. The evidence was finally clear. The leadership simply refused to act on it. By 1943, the production disparities had become almost absurd. Soviet tank production reached 29,000 units. German production reached 12,000. Soviet artillery production was triple German output. Soviet ammunition production was quadruple German capacity. The Red Army was not only replacing its losses, it was expanding in size while fighting. German forces were shrinking despite maximum industrial effort. Frontline German commanders reported facing Soviet attacks where numerical superiority was 10-1 or higher. Tactical skill could achieve local victories, but operational success was impossible when the enemy could replace losses overnight while German losses were permanent. The underestimation of Soviet production had created a strategic situation where Germany simply did not have enough soldiers, tanks, or ammunition to hold the Eastern Front regardless of tactical performance. The production underestimation's consequences appeared daily on the Eastern Front. German units that destroyed a Soviet tank regiment would face a rebuilt regiment within days. German artillery that silenced Soviet guns would face twice as many guns the following week. German forces that captured Soviet equipment dumps would find them restocked within hours. The Wehrmacht was fighting an enemy that could sustain losses indefinitely while German forces could not replace their casualties. This was not a matter of tactics or leadership. It was mathematics. Soviet industry was producing replacement equipment faster than German forces could destroy it. Meanwhile, every German tank lost was irreplaceable within any meaningful timeframe. By late 1943, experienced German commanders understood they were fighting a war they had already lost industrially, regardless of how many tactical victories they achieved. In 1943 and 1944, Germany finally attempted total industrial mobilization that should have begun in 1939. Production increased significantly. Germany built more tanks in 1944 than in any previous year. But the effort came far too late. Soviet production had been at maximum levels since 1942. The gap Germany tried to close had already grown so wide that even maximum German production could not narrow it meaningfully. Moreover, Soviet industry was geographically immune to German countermeasures while German factories were increasingly damaged by Allied bombing. Germany's belated mobilization was running up a down escalator. Every increase in German production was more than matched by continued Soviet output. The production race had been lost before Germany even recognized it was in one. Even as Soviet tanks reached the borders of the Reich, Nazi ideology prevented acknowledgement that the production underestimation had been caused by racial prejudice. Hitler continued to insist that Soviet production figures were inflated propaganda. Goebbels maintained that Soviet equipment was inferior and would collapse under pressure. German newsreels avoided showing the scale of Soviet equipment superiority visible to every frontline soldier. The leadership had locked itself into a worldview where Soviet industrial capacity could not be what evidence showed it was because ideology said Slavic peoples could not achieve such industrial sophistication. This was not merely mistaken analysis. It was willful blindness maintained even as Soviet industry's output physically destroyed German armies. The ideology that created the initial underestimation prevented learning from the error until Germany had been completely defeated. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the scale of the production underestimation became undeniable. The Soviet Union had produced over 100,000 tanks during the war. Germany had produced 50,000. Soviet artillery production exceeded German output by factors of 4 to 1. Soviet aircraft production was double German totals. These were not marginal differences. They were overwhelming disparities that made German defeat inevitable regardless of tactical skill or strategic brilliance. The numbers had been available through intelligence reports in 1940 and 1941. They had been dismissed because they contradicted ideology. Every German soldier who died on the Eastern Front after 1941 died in a war that production statistics had already lost. The tragedy was not that Germany lacked information. The tragedy was that German leadership chose ideology over evidence and sent millions to die as a result. The underestimation of Soviet industrial capacity was not an isolated error but part of a broader pattern where Nazi ideology systematically prevented accurate assessment of enemy capabilities. The same ideological framework that said Slavic peoples could not organize modern industry also said democracies were too weak to mobilize for total war, that Americans were too soft to fight effectively, and that Jews were simultaneously subhuman and secretly controlling world events. Each belief was internally contradictory and unsupported by evidence. Each shaped strategic decisions with catastrophic consequences. The production underestimation was perhaps the most consequential because it directly determined battlefield outcomes. But it reflected the same dynamic, leadership that valued ideological purity over objective analysis, that punished accurate reporting when it contradicted doctrine, and that preferred comfortable delusions to uncomfortable realities. After Germany's defeat, captured German officers were interrogated about how they had so thoroughly misjudged Soviet capabilities. Many expressed shock at the scale of Soviet production they had faced. But few acknowledged that the misjudgment stemmed from ideologically driven dismissal of available intelligence. Instead, they blamed Soviet geographical advantages, Allied assistance, or claimed Soviet production figures were still exaggerated. This was predictable. Acknowledging that racial ideology had caused strategic catastrophe would require admitting that their entire worldview had been fundamentally wrong. For officers who had staked their careers and sent men to die based on those beliefs, such acknowledgement was psychologically impossible. The lesson that ideology makes accurate strategic assessment impossible was one they could not learn even after total defeat. The cost of that failure to learn was measured in millions of lives lost for beliefs that were never based on reality. Military historians analyzing German decision-making during World War II consistently identify the underestimation of Soviet industrial capacity as one of the most consequential strategic errors of the war. Germany invaded the Soviet Union believing it faced an industrial inferior that would collapse within months. Instead, it faced an industrial superior with production capacity that was geographically invulnerable and growing throughout the war. This miscalculation was not caused by lack of intelligence. German intelligence services had collected substantial evidence about Soviet industrial capacity. The error was caused by ideological filtering that dismissed evidence contradicting Nazi racial doctrine. The pattern appears repeatedly in history. When ideologically driven regimes make strategic decisions, ideology overrides evidence with catastrophic results. The Nazi case is extreme, but the underlying dynamic, leaders who trust their worldview more than data, is universal and remains relevant. When Soviet forces reached Berlin in April 1945, they brought with them thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft produced by the industrial capacity German planners had said could not exist. The ruins of German cities testify to the price of ideological certainty. Millions of German soldiers had died fighting an enemy whose strength German leadership had refused to acknowledge until it was too late. The production underestimation was not merely a planning error. It was a fundamental failure of strategic leadership that confused ideological preference with objective reality. Every tank Germany built was outnumbered 3-1 because planners had assumed Soviet production was impossible. Every battlefield loss was permanent while Soviet losses were replaced overnight. The Wehrmacht fought with courage and skill against an industrial avalanche that German leadership had insisted could not exist. The underestimation destroyed not just German armies but the German state itself.